He was a powerful judge, until one moment of blind rage changed everything. When he slapped a young black boy in the courthouse, he had no idea who the child was. Then a voice cut through the silence. "Judge Grayson, did you just put your hands on my son?" Because this wasn't just any boy. He was the son of a Supreme Court justice, a man powerful enough to tear Grayson's world apart. As secrets unravel, the judge will face a reckoning he never saw coming. But will he learn the truth before his pride destroys him? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun painted long shadows across the courthouse steps as Judge Martin Grayson emerged from his black sedan. His polished shoes clicked against the concrete, each step as measured as the precise knot in his silk tie. The navy blue suit he wore spoke of authority, while his long overcoat added an extra layer of gravitas to his already commanding presence. Even the way he closed the car door, with a firm, controlled motion, reflected his methodical nature. A young clerk, arms full of files, nearly stumbled in his haste to step aside. Good morning, Your Honor," he stammered, clutching the manila folders closer to his chest as if they might shield him. Grayson's only response was a curt nod as he continued his ascent, his shoulders squared against the crisp morning air. Two junior attorneys stood near the entrance, their conversation dying as the judge approached. They offered quick, nervous greetings, their bodies tensing like students before a strict teacher. One of them smoothed his tie repeatedly, a nervous tick that drew Grayson's silent disapproval. He barely acknowledged them, his mind already focused on the day ahead, filled with the weight of decisions waiting to be made. Inside the courthouse lobby, the morning bustle was in full swing. The air carried the familiar mix of coffee, anxiety, and furniture polish, mingled with the musty scent of old law books. Defendants in orange jumpsuits sat on wooden benches, their chains creating soft metallic sounds with each movement. Lawyers hurried past, their briefcases bulging with papers, while clerks typed away at their desks with mechanical precision. The steady tap of keyboards mixed with hushed conversations and shuffling feet. "Morning, Judge," came a gruff voice. Bailiff James Holloway approached, his stocky frame carrying his uniform with the comfort of long familiarity. His badge caught the fluorescent light as he fell into step beside Grayson, his heavy utility belt jingling softly with each step. "Holloway," Grayson replied, his eyes scanning the growing line of people waiting for their cases to be heard. The sight made his jaw tighten, muscles working beneath his clean-shaven face. "Looks like another long day of keeping criminals off the streets." "That it does," Holloway agreed, matching the judge's pace. "Heard Judge Matthews gave probation to that convenience store robber yesterday." His tone carried a hint of disapproval, knowing how his superior would react. Grayson's face darkened. "Probation," he spat the word like it tasted bitter, his thin lips pressing into an even thinner line. "That's what's wrong with the system these days. Too soft. When I started, we knew how to handle criminals." His fingers tightened around his leather briefcase handle until his knuckles whitened. As they walked through the main hallway toward his chambers, the crowd parted before them like water around a stone. The click of Grayson's heels echoed against the marble floors, a steady rhythm broken only by the unexpected sound of childish laughter that seemed to bounce off the vaulted ceiling. Near one of the benches, a young black boy sat cross-legged on the floor, completely absorbed in playing with a toy car. The red plastic vehicle made quiet vrooming sounds as small hands guided it along imaginary roads on the polished floor, his innocence a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere around him. Grayson's steps faltered for a moment, his expression souring at the sight. The courthouse was a temple of justice, not a playground. He let out an irritated sigh, watching the child continue his play, oblivious to the judge's disapproval. His weathered hand twitched, as if fighting the urge to gesture the boy away. "No respect these days," Grayson muttered, reaching for the handle of his chamber's door. The words carried the weight of decades of similar complaints, each one a brick in the wall between him and the changing world outside. The brass handle felt cool under his grip as he pushed the door open, seeking refuge in his carefully ordered sanctuary. The morning bustle of the courthouse faded into background noise as 10-year-old Elijah Carter sat on the worn wooden bench outside Courtroom B. His legs, too short to reach the floor, swung back and forth in a gentle rhythm. The crisp white shirt and navy blazer of his private school uniform made him look like a miniature lawyer, complete with a perfectly knotted tie his father had helped him with that morning. His small hands gripped a shiny red toy car, a birthday present from his father. While Justice Benjamin Carter attended his meeting inside, Elijah created his own entertainment, making quiet vrooming sounds as he guided the car along the bench's edge. The morning sunlight streaming through the tall courthouse windows made the car's metallic paint shimmer and dance. "Good morning, sweetheart," called Ms. Martinez, a clerk with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, as she walked past. She reached out and ruffled his dark curls, making him giggle. Other courthouse staff couldn't help but smile at the boy's presence. His joy seemed to brighten the usually serious atmosphere, like a ray of sunshine breaking through storm clouds. Elijah continued his game, creating an imaginary racetrack between his father's worn leather briefcase and his own Pokémon backpack. The toy car zoomed through hairpin turns and jumped impossible gaps, all in his mind's eye. His quiet sound effects provided the perfect soundtrack to his imagination. Rachel Lewis, briefcase in hand and case files tucked under her arm, paused in her hurried stride. Her stern expression softened as she watched Elijah's creative play, her own memories of childhood momentarily breaking through her professional demeanor. "You having fun there, kid?" she asked, adjusting her glasses with her free hand. Elijah looked up with a bright smile that showed off his missing front tooth. "Yeah, this is my dad's office." His eyes sparkled with pride at the connection to his father's important work. Rachel chuckled, her shoulders relaxing. "Not exactly a playground, little man." "I know," Elijah said, but his grin didn't fade as he returned to his game. His laughter echoed softly through the hallway, a stark contrast to the serious conversations and worried whispers around him. The sound seemed to lighten the heavy atmosphere that usually hung in the courthouse air. He reached for his juice box, taking a quick sip before setting it on the bench beside him. As he returned to his play, his elbow knocked against the small table next to the bench. The juice box tipped, then fell, almost in slow motion. Several drops of bright red juice splattered onto a pair of expertly polished black shoes. Judge Grayson stopped mid-stride, his sharp eyes moving slowly downward to examine the spots on his leather shoes, each red droplet standing out like tiny rubies against the pristine black surface. The hallway seemed to hold its breath. Elijah's toy car froze mid-race, his small hand gripping it tightly as he looked up at the towering figure before him. The cheerful atmosphere evaporated instantly, replaced by a tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The polished marble floors of the courthouse reflected the morning sun as Judge Martin Grayson stood motionless, his eyes fixed on his expensive leather shoes. Small drops of juice trickled down the pristine surface, leaving sticky trails in their wake, marring the perfect shine he demanded of the cleaning staff each morning. His jaw clenched tight, a muscle twitching beneath his weathered skin, a telltale sign of his rising anger. Elijah's small frame went rigid on the bench, his Spider-Man backpack clutched protectively against his chest. The playful spark in his eyes dimmed as he sensed the sudden shift in the air, like a small animal sensing an approaching storm. His toy car fell silent in his trembling hands, its wheels no longer making the gentle vrooming sounds that had echoed through the hallway moments before. The usual morning bustle of the courthouse corridor died away, as if someone had pressed a universal pause button. Attorneys stopped mid-conversation, their briefcases hanging limply at their sides, eyes widening at the scene unfolding before them. Clerks froze at their stations, papers suspended in mid-shuffle, their morning routines forgotten. The heavy silence pressed down like a weight, thick with tension and unspoken fear. "Look what you've done." Grayson's voice came out as a low growl, each word dripping with decades of unchecked authority. His face flushed red, decades of unchallenged authority hardening his features into stone, his normally composed judicial demeanor cracking like thin ice. Before anyone could move, Grayson's hand shot out like a snake, fingers digging into Elijah's small arm, leaving white marks against the child's dark skin. The boy winced as the judge yanked him forward, nearly lifting him off the bench, his small feet scrambling to find purchase on the slick floor. "You little brat, learn some respect." Grayson's voice boomed through the hallway, bouncing off the walls like thunder. "This is why kids like you end up in my courtroom as criminals." The words carried an ugly undertone that made several onlookers flinch. The crack of palm against cheek echoed off the marble walls, sharp and devastating in its finality. The force of the slap knocked Elijah sideways, sending him stumbling back against the bench, his small body crumpling like a wilted flower. His small hand flew to his face, covering the angry red mark blooming across his brown skin, fingers trembling against his cheek. Gasps rippled through the corridor like a wave, a chorus of shocked inhales and muffled exclamations. Ms. Martinez covered her mouth in horror, her reading glasses slipping unnoticed down her nose. A young law clerk dropped her stack of files, papers scattering across the floor unnoticed, like fallen leaves in an autumn wind. Elijah's lower lip trembled as tears welled up in his wide, confused eyes, the kind of hurt that went deeper than physical pain. His toy car lay forgotten on the floor, its bright red paint a stark contrast against the cold marble, one wheel still spinning slowly. The boy's shoulders shook with silent sobs as he pressed himself against the bench, trying to make himself as small as possible, as if he could disappear entirely from this nightmare moment. Then, cutting through the shocked silence like a blade, came a deep, commanding voice, carrying both fury and controlled power. "Judge Grayson, did you just put your hands on my son?" Justice Benjamin Carter's imposing figure stood at the end of the hallway, his broad shoulders squared beneath his immaculate black suit. The morning light streaming through the tall windows cast a shadow that seemed to stretch endlessly across the marble floor, like a dark judgment creeping toward its target. His dark eyes, usually warm and thoughtful, now blazed with an intensity that made everyone in the corridor shrink back, their own gazes dropping to avoid his thunderous expression. Judge Grayson's face drained of color, leaving him ashen and shaken. The hand that had struck Elijah moments ago now hung limp at his side, trembling slightly. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out, like a fish gasping for air. With measured steps that echoed through the silent hall, each footfall a drumbeat of approaching reckoning, Justice Carter approached. His movements were controlled, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the fury simmering beneath his composed exterior. He knelt beside Elijah, gathering his son into his arms with gentle hands that contrasted sharply with his rigid posture. The boy buried his face in his father's chest, small fingers gripping the lapels of the expensive suit, seeking comfort in the familiar scent of his father's cologne. The courthouse staff pressed themselves against the walls, averting their eyes from the scene unfolding before them. Legal assistants clutched their files closer to their chests like shields, and even veteran attorneys found sudden interest in their shoes. The air grew thick with unspoken accusations and shame. I didn't know." Grayson's voice cracked, his usual authority crumbling like sand beneath a wave. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the full weight of his actions pressed down on him. Justice Carter's response cut through the air like steel. "Would you have acted any differently if Elijah wasn't my son?" The question hung in the space between them, heavy with implications and years of unconscious bias laid bare. Grayson's mouth worked soundlessly, his face contorting with the desperate search for words that wouldn't come. His hands fidgeted with his tie, then dropped to his sides in defeat. The proud judge who had ruled his courtroom with an iron fist now stood exposed, his prejudices laid bare in the harsh light of day, stripped of all his carefully constructed dignity. Justice Carter's gaze swept the corridor until it landed on a nearby bailiff, his eyes carrying a command that needed no voice to convey its urgency. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of earned authority, each word precise and cutting. "Escort Judge Grayson from the premises. Now." The courthouse buzzed with whispers and hushed conversations, the tension thick enough to slice. Clerks huddled in corners, their eyes following Judge Grayson as Bailiff Holloway led him toward the exit, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. The judge's perfectly pressed suit now looked wrinkled and disheveled, his usual commanding presence diminished to that of a common defendant. Justice Carter stood in the hallway, one hand resting protectively on Elijah's shoulder, his grip gentle but firm. The boy had stopped crying, but his small frame still trembled slightly, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. A few courthouse staff members approached to check on him, offering kind words and sympathetic smiles, some even kneeling to meet his eye level. "This is ridiculous," Grayson's voice boomed through the marble corridors as he yanked his arm free from Holloway's grip, causing several nearby assistants to jump. His face had turned an angry shade of red, and sweat beaded on his forehead, dripping down his temples. "I was merely teaching the boy proper behavior. This is how we maintain order." Justice Carter's response came in a quiet, measured tone that somehow carried more weight than Grayson's outburst, cutting through the tension like a knife. "You struck my son. In a courthouse, in front of witnesses. This isn't about discipline. It's about who you are, Martin. Who you've always been." The words hit Grayson like physical blows, each one landing with devastating accuracy. He glanced around, suddenly aware of the dozens of eyes watching him, judging him. Lawyers who had once scrambled to curry his favor now turned away in disgust. Court clerks who had feared his temper now whispered behind raised hands, their former fear replaced with contempt. Outside, camera flashes lit up the courthouse steps like summer lightning. A small crowd of reporters had gathered, their microphones ready, their faces eager for the story. As Grayson approached the glass doors, their voices carried through, sharp and demanding. "Judge Grayson, did you hit a child? Is it true you assaulted Justice Carter's son? Will you be facing charges? What does this mean for your career?" Grayson's jaw clenched, the muscles working beneath his skin. He shot one final glare over his shoulder but remained silent as Holloway guided him through the media gauntlet, his shoulders hunched against the barrage of questions. Back inside his office, Justice Carter watched the scene unfold through his window, his expression grave but composed. Elijah sat quietly in one of the leather chairs, his toy car forgotten in his lap, its wheels occasionally catching the light. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished desk, where Carter's phone had already begun to ring incessantly, each call bringing another demand for answers he wasn't ready to give. The evening shadows crept across Judge Grayson's living room as he slumped deeper into his leather armchair, the familiar comfort of the worn leather offering no solace tonight. The ice in his scotch had long since melted, watering down the expensive liquor he'd been nursing for the past hour. He barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the TV screen, where his face kept appearing in unflattering screenshots from courthouse security footage, each image making him wince. "Breaking news!" The anchor's voice filled the room, echoing off the walls of his suddenly too quiet house. Local Judge Martin Grayson is under investigation after assaulting a child at the Montgomery courthouse this morning. Sources confirm the victim was 10-year-old Elijah Carter, son of Supreme Court Justice Benjamin Carter. Witnesses describe the incident as shocking and completely unprovoked. Grayson's phone buzzed again, the 20th call in the past hour, each one feeling like another nail in his coffin. He glanced at the screen. Montgomery Times. Delete. Another buzz. Channel 5 News. Delete. His hands trembled as he rejected each call. The heavy crystal tumbler shook in his hand as he took another sip, amber liquid sloshing against the sides. How had everything fallen apart so quickly? Just this morning, he'd been Judge Martin Grayson, respected and feared throughout the county courthouse. Now he was watching his reputation crumble in real time on the evening news. His phone rang again. This time, the name made him sit up straighter, a spark of hope flickering. Senator William Garrison. "William," Grayson answered, his voice hoarse from hours of silence. "Martin, what the hell were you thinking?" Garrison's usually smooth political tone was sharp with anger, cutting through the phone. "I've got reporters camping outside my office asking for comments about my close association with you. This is a nightmare." "It's being blown out of proportion," Grayson muttered, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "The boy needed to learn." "Stop right there," Garrison cut him off. "You need to apologize. Now before this gets even worse." Grayson's lip curled in stubborn defiance. For what? That kid should have been taught respect. That kid is the son of a Supreme Court justice. Garrison's voice turned cold as ice. "You don't see the storm coming, do you? This isn't going away." "I have nothing to be sorry for." Grayson's words came out slurred, defiant, even as a small voice in the back of his mind whispered warnings. "Then you're an even bigger fool than I thought." The line went dead with a decisive click. Grayson turned up the volume on his TV, his fingers clumsy on the remote. Justice Carter's face filled the screen, his expression grave as he addressed a sea of reporters outside the courthouse steps. The weight of what he had done started to sink in, heavy as lead in his stomach, as the reality of his situation became painfully clear in the harsh glare of the media spotlight. Justice Carter stood at the podium, his tall frame casting a shadow over the microphone. Camera flashes lit up the courthouse steps like lightning, turning the morning into a strobing spectacle. His hands rested firmly on either side of the podium, steady and sure, betraying none of the anger that burned beneath his composed exterior. "Yesterday, in these very halls of justice, my 10-year-old son was assaulted by a sitting judge," Carter began, his deep voice carrying across the crowd with the weight of both father and justice. "A man trusted to uphold the law chose instead to strike a child for nothing more than spilled juice, a child whose only crime was being himself." The reporters leaned forward, pens scratching frantically against notepads, hungry for every word. Camera operators adjusted their equipment, ensuring they caught every nuance of Carter's expression. His eyes swept across the crowd, commanding their full attention with the same gravity he wielded in the Supreme Court. "But this isn't just about my son Elijah," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each carefully chosen word. "This is about every black child who has walked these halls feeling afraid. Every child who has been seen as a threat instead of what they are. Our future, our hope, our children. Children who deserve to feel safe in the presence of justice, not terrified by it." Inside his darkened living room, Judge Grayson's hand tightened around his glass until his knuckles turned white. The morning sun tried to peek through his drawn curtains, but he preferred the shadows now, finding bitter comfort in the darkness that matched his mood. On the TV screen, Carter's words cut through his defenses like a knife, each statement making him flinch. "When a judge sees a playing child and responds with violence," Carter's voice filled Grayson's room, echoing off the walls like an accusation. "We must ask ourselves what justice truly means in these halls. How many children has he sentenced while carrying these same prejudices? How many lives has he altered with this same bias?" The crowd before the courthouse murmured in agreement, the sound swelling like a wave. Several people nodded vigorously, some calling out in support, their voices creating a chorus of solidarity. Cameras continued to flash as Justice Carter's words spread across every major news network, ensuring this moment would be remembered. "This incident has exposed something ugly," Carter continued, his words measured but unflinching. "Something that has lived too long in the shadows of our justice system. Today, we bring it into the light. Today, we say enough. Grayson took another long sip of scotch, watching his career crumble in real time. The morning news ticker scrolled beneath Carter's speech in an endless parade of condemnation. Supreme Court Justice condemns local judges' actions. Civil rights leaders call for investigation. Courthouse incident sparks national debate. Each headline felt like another nail in his professional coffin. Carter's final words rang out clear and determined, resonating with both authority and compassion. My son will be okay. But this isn't about just one child anymore. This is about every child who deserves better from those sworn to serve justice. This is about change that cannot wait another day. Grayson lifted his remote and clicked off the TV with trembling fingers. The screen went black, leaving him alone in his darkened living room with nothing but his thoughts and his shame. The silence pressed in around him like a physical weight, heavy with the consequences of actions he could never take back. Inside the austere federal courtroom, early morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across stacks of manila folders and legal documents. A team of investigators, their faces serious and focused, methodically sorted through Judge Grayson's case history. Justice Carter stood at the head of the long oak table, his presence commanding even in silence. His fingers traced the edge of a particularly thick file as he addressed the room. 20 years of rulings. Let's see what they tell us. Rachel Lewis, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, stepped forward with a file clutched to her chest. Your Honor, I've been tracking these patterns for years. She spread out several cases across the table. Look at these 2 drug possession cases from 2019. Nearly identical circumstances, but drastically different outcomes. The investigators leaned in as she pointed to the documents. White defendant, first offense, probation and rehabilitation. Black defendant, first offense, 5 years in prison. Her voice trembled with controlled anger. And this isn't an isolated incident. More files opened, more patterns emerged. Charts and statistics filled whiteboards, painting a damning picture in black and white. 3 strikes cases, one investigator noted, adjusting his glasses. White defendants averaged 2-year sentences. Black defendants? He shook his head. 15 years minimum. Justice Carter's jaw tightened as he reviewed case after case. The evidence was overwhelming. Decades of bias laid bare in stark numbers and stark consequences. Rachel pulled out one final folder. This one haunts me, she said softly. 2 teenagers caught joyriding. The white teen got community service. The black teen. She met Carter's eyes. Still serving time. The room fell silent as the weight of the injustice settled over them. Hundreds of lives affected. Thousands of families impacted. All because one man had wielded his gavel like a weapon against those he'd deemed guilty before they'd even spoken a word. A young clerk burst through the door, waving a newspaper. Sir, it's hit the press. Someone leaked the preliminary findings. The headline screamed across the front page. Federal investigation reveals decades of racial bias in Grayson's courtroom. Sunlight crept through the curtains of Judge Martin Grayson's bedroom as his phone buzzed relentlessly on the nightstand. He rolled over with a groan, his head pounding from too much scotch the night before. The screen showed 37 missed calls and countless text messages. Leave me alone, he muttered, but the phone kept vibrating. Each buzz felt like a hammer against his temples. Finally, he sat up and grabbed the device. The first message made his stomach drop. Supreme Court Judicial Review Board opens official inquiry into Judge Grayson's conduct. His hands trembled as he scrolled through the notifications. The local bar association had scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss his possible disbarment. News outlets were running constant coverage of the incident. Desperate, he started calling his usual contacts, fellow judges, politicians, longtime supporters. Each call went straight to voicemail or ended with a quick, "Sorry, can't help you with this one." In his study, surrounded by leather-bound law books and framed certificates that suddenly felt meaningless, Grayson dialed Senator Garrison's private number. After 3 rings, Garrison answered. "Tell me you have a way out of this," Grayson pleaded, his voice hoarse. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds before Garrison spoke. "This is bigger than you, Martin. You're on your own." The line went dead. Grayson stumbled into his bathroom, gripping the marble sink as he stared at his reflection. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his usually immaculate silver hair was disheveled. "I did nothing wrong," he muttered to his reflection. But his hands were shaking, betraying the fear he refused to acknowledge. Justice Benjamin Carter's fingers traced the edges of yet another case file. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his desk, illuminating decades of Judge Grayson's rulings spread before him. Each page told the same story: harsh sentences for black defendants, lighter ones for white offenders. The pattern was clear as day. The door opened, and Monica Carter strode in, her eyes blazing with maternal fury. She'd barely slept since the incident, spending hours comforting Elijah through his nightmares. "Ben," she said, her voice tight with anger, "why isn't that man in handcuffs yet?" Carter looked up at his wife, understanding the rage that burned beneath her controlled exterior. "It's not that simple, honey. We need to build an airtight case." "Not that simple?" Monica's hand slammed down on his desk, scattering papers. "He hit our baby. In broad daylight. In a courthouse." "I know." Carter's voice was soft but firm. "Trust me, I know. You're a Supreme Court Justice, Ben. You have the power to end his career right now, to make sure he never hurts another child." Carter stood up slowly, walking to the window. The weight of his position, his influence, pressed down on his shoulders. "If we move too quickly, if we let this become about revenge—" "This isn't about revenge," Monica cut in. "This is about justice, about protecting other families from what we're going through." Carter nodded, turning back to face her. His decision crystallized in that moment. Walking to his desk, he pressed the intercom button. "Sarah, please call in the press. It's time to make a statement." Minutes later, standing before a sea of reporters and cameras, Justice Carter's voice rang out clear and strong. "This isn't just about my son. This is about every family Judge Grayson has harmed, and we will bring his actions into the light." Across town, Grayson sat in his living room, watching the broadcast. His jaw clenched tight as Carter's words echoed through the speakers. He knew, with crushing certainty, that Carter wouldn't let this go. The kitchen was filled with the warm aroma of Monica's homemade lasagna, but Elijah couldn't bring himself to eat. His fork moved listlessly across the plate, creating tiny trenches in the sauce, as his parents watched with concern. Monica reached across the table, her hand gentle as she touched Elijah's arm. "Baby, you've barely touched your food. It's your favorite." Elijah shrugged, his shoulders heavy with an invisible weight no 10-year-old should have to carry. The bruise on his cheek had faded, but the memory remained fresh and raw. The ceiling fan whirred softly overhead, filling the uncomfortable silence. Justice Carter cleared his throat, trying to catch his son's eye, but Elijah kept his gaze fixed on his plate. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Elijah spoke. "I don't want to go back to school." Monica's fork clinked against her plate as she set it down. "Why not, sweetheart?" Elijah's lower lip trembled slightly. His fingers gripped the edge of the table as he struggled to find the words. "What if people look at me different now? What if they think I'm weak?" The pain in his voice made Justice Carter's chest tighten. He pushed back his chair and knelt beside his son, placing a strong, steady hand on Elijah's shoulder. The boy's frame felt so small beneath his palm. "Look at me, son," Carter said softly. When Elijah finally raised his eyes, Carter saw tears threatening to spill. "You are not weak. You are good. And no one has the right to make you feel otherwise." Elijah nodded mechanically, but his eyes told a different story. The incident had shaken something deep inside him, something that couldn't be fixed with just words. Across the table, Monica caught her husband's eye. Their shared look spoke volumes. Their son's wounds went deeper than the fading mark on his cheek. Inside the federal courthouse's grand hearing room, David Lancaster dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief. The wooden witness stand felt confining, like a cage he couldn't escape. His hands trembled as he adjusted his tie for the third time in 5 minutes. Judge Sarah Martinez, head of the Judicial Review Board, leaned forward. "Mr. Lancaster, you served as Judge Grayson's law clerk for how long?" 10 years, Your Honor." His voice was barely above a whisper. "And during that time, did you observe any patterns in Judge Grayson's sentencing?" Lancaster's eyes darted around the packed room. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. Fellow clerks watched with bated breath, the weight of a decade's silence pressed down on his shoulders. "Mr. Lancaster?" Judge Martinez prompted. He took a deep breath. "Judge Grayson, he had different standards." Lancaster's voice cracked. "Black defendants always got the maximum sentence. Always. But white defendants..." He paused, swallowing hard. "They'd get lighter sentences, probation, second chances." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. "Can you provide specific examples?" Lancaster nodded, his resolve strengthening. "Last year, 2 drug possession cases, same amount. The white defendant got probation. The black defendant got 5 years. His words came faster now, like a dam breaking. It happened over and over. Different cases, same pattern. Judge Martinez's pen scratched against her notepad. "Did Judge Grayson ever make explicit statements about race?" "Yes." Lancaster's hands clenched the edge of the witness stand. He'd say things like, "These people never learn," or "That's how they are." He thought nobody was paying attention, but we all heard. The murmur in the courtroom grew louder. "And why are you coming forward now, Mr. Lancaster?" Lancaster's eyes welled up. "Because I can't stay silent anymore. What he did to that little boy, it wasn't an isolated incident. It was who he always was." Miles away, in his darkened living room, Grayson watched the testimony unfold on his TV screen. His whiskey glass creaked under his white-knuckled grip as Lancaster's words echoed through the speakers. The news ticker below read, "Former law clerk exposes Judge Grayson's racial bias." The morning sun hadn't yet cleared the horizon when camera flashes lit up Judge Martin Grayson's front lawn like lightning strikes. He stood at his bedroom window, watching reporters huddle near his front gate. Their breath made little clouds in the cold morning air. Grayson straightened his tie, checking his reflection. Even now, appearance mattered. Order mattered. But his usually steady hands betrayed him, fumbling with the silk fabric. The doorbell rang. Again and again. "Judge Grayson, do you have a statement about the investigation?" "What do you say to the allegations of racial bias? Will you resign from the bench?" He grabbed his briefcase and coat, squaring his shoulders. The moment he opened his front door, the cameras turned on him like hungry wolves. Microphones thrust toward his face, bodies pressed close. Questions flew like arrows. "No comment," he said, pushing through the crowd. His polished shoes crunched on the frosty grass. "Do you regret hitting Elijah Carter?" a reporter shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Grayson's jaw clenched. "No comment." That's when he saw her. Rebecca stood at the edge of the crowd, wearing her navy pantsuit, the one she wore for important court appearances. Her arms were crossed, her expression hard. She looked so much like her mother in that moment it made his chest ache. Their eyes met across the sea of reporters. Rebecca's disappointment was clear, cutting deeper than any question the journalists could hurl at him. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The slight shake of her head said everything. Then she turned, her heels clicking on the sidewalk as she walked away. Grayson felt something crack inside him, a hairline fracture in the wall of certainty he'd built around himself. His daughter, his only child, walking away from him like he was a stranger. No, worse than a stranger. Like he was everything she'd spent her career fighting against. The reporters kept shouting questions, but Grayson barely heard them. He watched Rebecca's figure grow smaller, disappearing into the crowd, taking something vital with her. The ethics board conference room felt heavy with anticipation. 5 stern faces looked at Justice Carter from across the polished oak table. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. "Justice Carter," Board Chairman Phillips began, his voice measured. "We understand the personal nature of this situation. That's why we're giving you input on how to proceed." Carter sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table. Years of courtroom experience had taught him to keep his emotions in check, even when his heart was racing. "We have 2 paths forward," Phillips continued, sliding 2 folders across the table. "Option 1, we pursue criminal charges for judicial misconduct and assault. Option 2, we let the administrative process take its course. His career ends, but without criminal prosecution." Carter opened each folder carefully, scanning the contents. The evidence was overwhelming. Decades of biased rulings, discriminatory comments, patterns of behavior that showed deep-seated prejudice. When he got home that evening, Monica was waiting in the kitchen. Her eyes blazed when he explained the options. "You can't be serious," she said, pacing the floor. "That man hit our son. He needs to face real consequences." Carter loosened his tie. "Monica, listen." "No, you listen," she cut in. "He's getting away with it. A cushy retirement while black families are still dealing with the aftermath of his rulings." "He's not getting away with anything," Carter replied calmly. "His reputation, his legacy, everything he's built, it's all going to crumble. The world will see exactly who Martin Grayson is." Monica shook her head, tears of frustration in her eyes. "It's not enough. He deserves worse." Later, in his home office, Carter sat alone with the damning report. Each page detailed another instance of Grayson's prejudice, another family torn apart by his biased sentencing. The weight of the decision pressed down on his shoulders. Justice or retribution? The choice was his to make. The morning sun filtered through the courthouse's high windows, casting long shadows across the packed room. Judge Martin Grayson sat rigidly in the defendant's chair, his once commanding presence now diminished. His perfectly pressed suit couldn't hide the strain of the past weeks etched on his face. Camera flashes punctuated the tense atmosphere as reporters scribbled in their notepads. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators leaning forward, eager to witness the fall of a once powerful judge. Board Chairman Phillips cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the hushed chamber. "After careful review of the evidence and testimony presented, this board has reached its decision regarding Judge Martin Grayson." Grayson's jaw tightened, but his expression remained stone-faced. "The board finds that Judge Grayson has demonstrated conduct unbecoming of his position, shown clear racial bias in his rulings, and committed assault against a minor on courthouse grounds." Phillips paused, his voice growing firmer. "Therefore, effective immediately, Judge Martin Grayson is hereby stripped of his judicial position, disbarred, and permanently barred from holding any legal office in the future." The courtroom erupted in a wave of reactions. Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd. Several attorneys exchanged knowing looks, while others shook their heads in dismay. Grayson remained motionless, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. His face betrayed no emotion, but the slight tremor in his hands told a different story. Outside the courthouse, the scene transformed into chaos. Television cameras swung toward Grayson as he pushed through the heavy doors. Reporters swarmed him like hungry wolves, microphones thrust into his face. "Judge Grayson, do you have any regrets?" a reporter shouted over the din. Grayson's carefully maintained composure cracked. His face twisted with anger as he snarled, "This is a disgrace!" He shoved past the crowd, his shoulders squared despite the weight of his disgrace. In his office, high above the courthouse steps, Justice Carter watched the scene unfold on the news. The victory he'd achieved felt hollow, leaving him with an unexpected emptiness. The evening news flickered across the Carter family's living room, casting a blue glow on their faces. Elijah sat cross-legged on the plush leather couch, his toy car forgotten on the coffee table. His mother, Monica, perched beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as they watched footage of Judge Grayson leaving the courthouse in disgrace. "Look at him," Monica muttered. "Still won't admit he did anything wrong." Elijah's small fingers traced the fading mark on his cheek, his eyes fixed on the screen. The reporters' voices seemed far away as he watched the man who had struck him push through the crowd of cameras and microphones. Justice Carter stood by the window, his tall frame outlined against the gathering darkness outside. The weight of the day's events hung heavy in the room. "Did he deserve it, Dad?" Elijah's voice was soft, uncertain. His father turned, studying his son's face with gentle eyes. "He deserved the truth," Carter replied carefully. "Sometimes the truth is the hardest punishment of all." Elijah nodded slowly, his young mind wrestling with concepts bigger than himself. He had expected to feel happy when Judge Grayson got in trouble, but instead he felt different, confused, like there was more to understand than just good guys and bad guys. Monica reached over and squeezed his shoulder. "You okay, baby?" "Yeah," Elijah said, but his voice wavered slightly. I thought I'd feel better when he got punished." Justice Carter moved to sit on Elijah's other side. "Justice isn't about making us feel better, son. It's about making things right." Outside, rain began to patter against the windows, matching the somber mood. Across town, in a darkened house, Martin Grayson sat alone, surrounded by the ruins of his career and reputation. While the rain fell steadily harder, the shadows stretched long across Judge Martin Grayson's living room as evening settled in. Dust motes danced in the thin beam of light that managed to slip through his heavy curtains. Once pristine furniture now wore a thick layer of gray, untouched for days. In the kitchen, unopened envelopes formed messy piles on the marble counter. Final notice stamps glared red against white paper. His normally immaculate home had become a reflection of his fallen status, neglected and forgotten. Grayson's hand trembled as he picked up his phone. The screen showed dozens of missed calls from reporters, but none from friends or colleagues. With a deep breath, he dialed the one number he had been saving as his last resort. "William," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "It's Martin." The line crackled with Senator Garrison's heavy sigh. "What do you want?" "Tell me you have a way out of this." Grayson's words came out more desperate than he intended. "There must be something." "You burned every bridge, Martin," Garrison cut him off, his tone icy. "You're on your own." "William, please!" But the line was already dead. Grayson stared at the phone in his hand. The silence of his empty house pressed in around him. No more courthouse calls. No more legal briefs to review. No more power. No more respect. His legs gave out, and he collapsed onto his leather couch. The ceiling above him blurred as reality crashed down. Everything he had built over decades, his career, his reputation, his relationships, all of it was gone. He was truly alone. A sharp knock echoed through Grayson's silent house. He looked up from his coffee cup, frowning. Nobody had visited in weeks. The sound came again, more insistent this time. Grayson shuffled to the door in his wrinkled dress shirt and unpolished shoes. When he opened it, the morning light hit his eyes, making him squint. As his vision adjusted, his breath caught in his throat. Justice Benjamin Carter stood on his doorstep, tall and composed in a perfectly pressed suit. His presence seemed to fill the entire doorframe, making Grayson feel small in his own home. "What are you doing here?" Grayson's voice came out rough, defensive. Carter didn't answer. He simply stepped forward, forcing Grayson to back up into his own foyer. The contrast between them was stark. Carter's dignified bearing against Grayson's disheveled appearance, the judge's steady gaze meeting Grayson's uncertain one. "Come to gloat?" Grayson tried to sound bitter, but his voice wavered. "Here to see how far the mighty have fallen?" The house's musty air hung between them. Empty liquor bottles lined the coffee table. Newspapers with headlines about Grayson's disgrace were scattered across the floor. Carter took in the scene, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to face Grayson directly. "You think you're the victim, Martin?" The words hit Grayson like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to argue, to defend himself as he had done countless times before. But for the first time in his life, no words came. He stood there, mouth working silently, as the weight of Carter's question sank in. All his carefully constructed justifications seemed to crumble in the face of this simple truth. "What ... Grayson's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "What do I do?" Justice Carter's expression didn't soften, but something shifted in his eyes. "Live with it," he said simply. The small apartment on the outskirts of Montgomery felt nothing like home. Grayson sat in a metal folding chair, staring at blank walls. His expensive furniture and law books were gone, sold to pay mounting debts. A single bed, the chair, and a rickety table were all that remained of his former life. He hadn't left the apartment in days. The local grocery store delivered his food, and he paid extra to avoid human contact. His reflection in the bathroom mirror had become a stranger, unshaven, unkempt, hollow-eyed. Across town, Justice Carter sat in his office, watching rain streak down the windows. The investigation into Grayson's past cases continued, revealing more instances of bias. But something nagged at him. Would removing one prejudiced judge really change the system? "Dad?" Elijah stood in the doorway of his office, backpack slung over one shoulder. "Can we get ice cream?" Carter studied his son's face. The fear was fading, but sometimes Elijah still flinched when strangers moved too quickly. The incident had left its mark. "Sure, buddy, let me grab my coat." As they walked to the ice cream parlor, Carter noticed how Elijah kept close to his side, eyes darting around more than before. But there was progress too. He'd started raising his hand in class again, playing with his friends at recess. In his bare apartment, Grayson pulled the curtains tighter. A news van had driven past earlier, probably hunting for a follow-up story. He'd rather stay in darkness than face the world he'd lost. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds as Elijah and his father sat on a park bench, ice cream cones in hand. Chocolate dripped down Elijah's fingers as he laughed at a squirrel darting past. It was a small thing, that laugh, but it was the first real one Carter had heard in weeks. His son was healing, finding his way back to joy. Maybe that was enough, not changing the whole world, but protecting this small piece of it. Elijah grinned up at his father, ice cream smeared across his chin. "Can we come here again tomorrow?" Carter's heart lifted at the sight of that smile. "Anytime you want, son. Anytime you want." The autumn breeze rustled through the trees lining Pennsylvania Avenue, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and fresh coffee from nearby cafes. Justice Carter watched his son skip ahead, pointing excitedly at the historic buildings that dotted the Washington, D.C. landscape. Elijah's laughter echoed off the marble facades, bright and clear, a sound that had been missing for too long. "Dad, look at that!" Elijah called out, gesturing toward a street performer juggling near the park entrance. His eyes sparkled with the pure joy that only a child could possess. Carter smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in months. The shadows that had haunted Elijah's expression were finally fading, replaced by the innocent wonder that should have never left his face in the first place. They meandered through the park, their footsteps crunching on scattered leaves. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the path, and the air held that perfect crispness that made autumn in D.C. so special. That's when Carter saw him. On a weathered park bench sat a figure hunched against the cooling air. His coat, once expensive but now showing wear, hung loosely on his thinner frame. Gray hair, unkempt and longer than the strict military cut he once maintained, fell across his forehead. Martin Grayson. The former judge lifted his head, perhaps sensing their presence. His eyes, no longer carrying their usual sharp judgment, met Carter's. The change in him was startling. Gone was the arrogant set of his shoulders, the contemptuous curl of his lip. Instead, there was something else, a quiet acceptance, perhaps even understanding. They held each other's gaze for a long moment. No words passed between them. None were needed. The year had carved its lessons deep into Grayson's face, written in the new lines around his eyes and the defeated slope of his shoulders. Elijah, caught up in watching a squirrel dart across their path, seemed not to notice the man on the bench. Carter felt a surge of gratitude for this small mercy. Carter gave Grayson a slight nod, not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement, recognition of the price paid, of lessons learned too late. Taking Elijah's hand in his, Carter continued down the path, leaving Grayson behind on his bench as the autumn day drew to a close. Sunlight crept through dusty blinds, casting thin stripes across Martin Grayson's unmade bed. He blinked awake slowly, his body stiff from the cheap mattress that squeaked with every movement. The clock on his nightstand had stopped working weeks ago. He hadn't bothered to replace the batteries. His morning routine had become a shadow of what it once was. No more pressed suits or polished shoes. No more power breakfasts or important phone calls. Just a worn bathrobe, instant coffee, and silence. The apartment was small, a studio with peeling wallpaper and water stains on the ceiling. His law degree, once proudly displayed in his chambers, now sat in a cardboard box under his bed. He couldn't bear to look at it anymore. Grayson shuffled to the kitchenette, his slippers scraping against the linoleum floor. The coffee maker sputtered and coughed, producing a weak stream of brown liquid. He grabbed his chipped mug, the one that used to say, "World's Best Judge," before the letters started wearing off. The TV clicked on with a static buzz. Morning news filled the empty space with artificial cheerfulness. Grayson stirred his coffee absently, not really watching until a familiar face appeared on screen. Justice Benjamin Carter stood at a podium, his presence commanding even through the small screen. The headline scrolled across the bottom. Supreme Court Justice Benjamin Carter leads new initiative for judicial reform. Grayson's hand tightened around his coffee mug. Carter looked confident, respected, everything Grayson used to be. The reporter's voice droned on about Carter's achievements, his dedication to fairness, his vision for a better justice system. "The time has come for real change," Carter's voice filled the tiny apartment. "We must ensure that every person who enters our courts is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race or background." Grayson's coffee had gone cold, but he barely noticed. He watched as clips showed Carter meeting with other justices, shaking hands with senators, receiving standing ovations. The world hadn't just moved on without him. It had improved without him. The segment ended with Carter smiling, his son Elijah standing proudly beside him. Grayson clicked off the TV, the silence rushing back like a wave. He stared into his coffee cup, seeing his distorted reflection in the dark liquid. The man looking back at him wasn't the feared judge who once commanded respect with a single glare. He was just another forgotten man, living with the consequences of his actions. His hands trembled slightly as he set down the mug. The morning sun had risen higher now, illuminating the dust particles floating through his empty apartment, a perfect metaphor for what his life had become. The afternoon sun beat down on Grayson's hunched shoulders as he shuffled along the crowded sidewalk. His shoes, once expensive Italian leather, now scuffed and worn, scraped against the concrete with each heavy step. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground, avoiding the faces of passers-by who might recognize him. The courthouse loomed ahead, its marble columns casting long shadows. Grayson's stomach clenched. Just months ago, he had climbed those steps like a king ascending his throne. Now he hurried past, feeling like an exile from his own kingdom. The familiar green awning of Carter's Coffee caught his eye. Before everything fell apart, he'd stopped here every morning. The baristas used to have his order ready before he reached the counter. Black coffee, extra hot, served with deference and a dash of fear. The bell chimed weakly as he pushed open the door. The aroma of fresh coffee hit him, bringing back memories of better days. Behind the counter stood Mike, the morning shift barista, who used to practically bow when Grayson entered. Now Mike barely glanced up. "What can I get you?" Just a small coffee," Grayson mumbled, digging in his pocket. He pulled out a crumpled dollar bill, smoothing it against the counter with trembling fingers. Mike looked at the worn bill, then at Grayson's threadbare jacket and unwashed hair. Something flickered across his face. Not kindness, but that terrible mix of disgust and pity that Grayson had grown to hate. "Don't worry about it," Mike said, turning away. "It's on the house." The words stung worse than any insult. Grayson's cheeks burned as he accepted the cup, knowing it wasn't generosity that prompted the gesture. It was pity, the final indignity for a man who once commanded respect. He found a corner table and sat alone, holding the paper cup between his palms. Around him, customers chatted and laughed, their lives continuing as if he didn't exist. Not one person met his eyes. Not one person acknowledged the fallen judge in their midst. The fluorescent lights flickered in Grayson's cramped apartment as he dropped his keys on the scratched coffee table. Bills spilled from his trembling hands: electric, water, rent. All marked in angry red letters. Final notice. His fingers brushed against something different, a plain white envelope with no return address. The paper felt expensive, familiar somehow. He tore it open carefully, pulling out a single sheet of cream-colored stationery. His breath caught as he recognized the neat, precise handwriting. Rebecca. His daughter's words blurred before his eyes as he began to read. "Dad, I don't know if you'll even read this. I've spent a year trying to decide if you deserve a second chance. I still don't know. But I also know that hate is a prison, and I refuse to live in one. I don't forgive you yet. But I need to know if you're even trying to be a better man." Grayson's legs gave out. He collapsed onto his threadbare couch, the letter trembling in his grip. Each word felt like a knife, sharp with truth, cutting through the walls of denial he'd built around himself. His daughter's handwriting swam before his eyes. The perfectly formed letters, so controlled and precise, just like he'd taught her to be. But the words themselves were raw, honest in a way he'd never allowed himself to be. The paper crinkled under his tightening fingers. His chest felt hollow, like someone had scraped out everything inside him and left nothing but echoes. Rebecca's words played over and over in his mind. "I don't forgive you yet." Yet, that single word held more hope than he deserved. Grayson stared at the letter, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the paper. In his daughter's careful words, he saw his last chance at redemption, and the terrifying possibility that he might not be worthy of it. The courthouse steps felt different under Grayson's worn shoes. No longer did they carry the confident stride of authority. Each step was hesitant, almost shameful. He pulled his coat tighter, hoping no one would recognize him. Inside, the familiar smell of polished wood and paper hit him. The security guard barely glanced at his ID, not connecting this shabby man to the feared judge who once ruled these halls. Courtroom 3 was exactly as he remembered. Grayson slipped into the back row, becoming just another face in the gallery. The young black defendant sat straight-backed at the defense table, his hands folded neatly. Clean-cut, well-dressed, nervous. The judge's voice cut through the air like ice. The defendant's prior record suggests a pattern of behavior. Grayson flinched. He knew that tone, had used it himself countless times. Cold, dismissive, already decided. The defense attorney rose, her voice passionate but controlled. "Your Honor, my client has completed his degree. He has a job offer. This minor offense shouldn't erase years of hard work and rehabilitation." But Grayson saw it in the judge's eyes. That familiar wall of indifference. How many times had he worn that same expression? How many lives had he altered with that same calculated disregard? The young man's shoulders tensed with each word from the bench. Grayson remembered others just like him. Dozens, hundreds maybe. Young faces full of hope, crushed under the weight of his gavel. He'd called it justice. Now, watching from these worn wooden benches, he saw it for what it was. Cruelty, masked as law. His stomach churned. The courtroom suddenly felt too warm, too close. The defense attorney's words echoed off the walls. Words he'd dismissed countless times before. Words about family, about potential, about human dignity. The judge's response was clipped, efficient, a mirror of Grayson's own past demeanor. The court is not impressed by these arguments. Grayson stood abruptly, needing air. As he moved toward the door, the defense attorney turned. Their eyes met briefly. He saw in her gaze what he'd seen in countless others over the years. Contempt, recognition, judgment. She knew exactly who he was, what he represented. He hurried out, her silent accusation following him through the heavy wooden doors. The dim light from a single desk lamp cast long shadows across Grayson's apartment. His hands trembled as he held Rebecca's letter in one hand and an old bottle of whiskey in the other. The paper was already creased from how many times he'd folded and unfolded it, reading those words over and over. "I need to know if you're even trying to be a better man." He set the letter down on his scratched wooden desk, next to a blank sheet of paper that seemed to mock him with its emptiness. The whiskey bottle clinked against the glass as he poured, the amber liquid catching the weak light. The familiar smell wafted up, promising the same comfort it had given him every night since his fall from grace. His fingers wrapped around the glass, muscle memory taking over. How many nights had he spent like this, drowning his thoughts, his shame, his anger in alcohol until morning came? Rebecca's words burned in his mind. Trying to be a better man. Was he? Could he? The glass felt heavy in his hand. He lifted it halfway to his lips, then stopped. His reflection in the window showed a stranger. Gray hair unkempt, shoulders hunched, eyes hollow. When had he become this person? Grayson's hand shook as he slowly, deliberately set the untouched glass back down. The soft thud seemed to echo in the quiet room. He reached for a pen instead, its weight unfamiliar after so long. The blank paper stared up at him. Once, words had come so easily. Judgments, opinions, verdicts. Now, facing the task of writing to his own daughter, he felt paralyzed. "Dear Rebecca," he whispered to himself, but couldn't bring himself to write even that much. How do you begin to acknowledge a lifetime of wrongs? How do you tell your child you're sorry when you're just starting to understand what you're sorry for? Grayson sat there, pen hovering over paper, the untouched whiskey glass within reach, as the night ticked slowly by. For the first time in his life, he had to face himself without the shield of his position or his pride. Just a man, trying to find words that might begin to bridge the chasm he had created. Rebecca's heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she entered her apartment, dropping her heavy briefcase by the door. The day had been brutal. 3 court appearances and a mountain of paperwork. Her dark curls were coming loose from their neat bun, and her shoulders ached from tension. She flicked on the lights and made her way to the kitchen counter where a small pile of mail waited. Bills, advertisements, and then her hand froze over a plain white envelope. No return address, but she recognized the careful, precise handwriting immediately. her father's. Standing there in her wrinkled suit, Rebecca felt her heart pound against her ribs. She'd sent her letter weeks ago, never really expecting a response. Part of her had wanted to believe he was beyond reaching, that the man who'd raised her was lost to his own pride and prejudice. The envelope felt impossibly heavy in her hands. She walked to her small dining table, sinking into a chair. The setting sun painted orange streaks across her walls as she stared at the letter, turning it over and over. "Come on, Rebecca," she whispered to herself. "You wanted this." With trembling fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded a single sheet of paper. The message was short, just 4 lines, but they were 4 lines she never thought she'd see from Martin Grayson. "Rebecca, I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to earn it. I don't know where to begin. Maybe you can help me figure it out." Dad. Hot tears spilled down her cheeks, dropping onto the paper. She quickly wiped them away, not wanting to smear the ink. The words were simple, almost stark in their honesty. No justifications, no excuses, just vulnerability from a man who'd never shown any. Rebecca read the lines again and again, trying to find the hidden agenda, the manipulation she'd grown to expect. But there was none. Just 4 sentences that carried the weight of decades of pain and possibility. She stood up, letter in hand, and walked to her desk. Opening the bottom drawer, she carefully placed the letter inside. Not ready to answer it yet, but not ready to throw it away either. It wasn't forgiveness. She wasn't there yet. But it was something. A crack in the wall. A first step. The late autumn wind whipped through the streets of downtown Montgomery, sending fallen leaves skittering across the sidewalk. Martin Grayson pulled his threadbare coat tighter around his shoulders, ducking his head against the chill. The coat was a far cry from his old designer overcoats, but those had been sold months ago to pay bills. He shuffled along, barely glancing up at the people who passed him. Some still recognized him. He saw it in their quick, sideways looks and hurried steps to avoid him. It was easier to keep his eyes on the cracked concrete beneath his feet. The sound of familiar laughter made him freeze. His heart stumbled in his chest as he slowly lifted his gaze. Across the street, Justice Benjamin Carter walked with measured steps, gesturing as he spoke to a colleague. His suit was immaculate, his presence commanding, everything Grayson used to be. Carter's voice carried across the street, strong and assured, discussing some legal precedent. Grayson's first instinct was to turn away, to duck into the nearest doorway or cross to the other side. His feet wouldn't move. Then Carter stopped mid-sentence. His eyes met Grayson's across the busy street. Time seemed to slow. The traffic noise faded. The wind died down. In that moment, everything that had happened, the slap, the investigation, the disgrace, hung in the air between them. Grayson's throat tightened. Words formed and died on his lips. What could he possibly say? How do you address the man who rightfully destroyed your life? Carter's expression didn't change. No anger, no satisfaction, no pity, just a steady, measuring look. Then, almost imperceptibly, Carter nodded once. It wasn't forgiveness. They both knew that wasn't possible. It wasn't compassion or pity either. It was simpler than that. Acknowledgement. Recognition of their shared history, of the justice that had been served, of the price that had been paid. As Carter turned away, continuing his conversation, Grayson let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. That nod, that simple gesture, meant something. Maybe. The phone's harsh ring cut through the silence of Grayson's small apartment. He stared at the screen, his heart hammering against his ribs. Rebecca's name glowed back at him, a name he hadn't seen flash across his phone in over a year. His hand trembled as he reached for it. Once, his hands had been steady, signing countless rulings without hesitation. Now, he could barely hold the phone without shaking. The ringing continued, each chime feeling like an accusation. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. Memories flooded back. Rebecca's graduation from law school, her first case as a civil rights attorney, the pride in her eyes when she won. Then the way she had looked at him that day outside his house, surrounded by reporters, her eyes filled with disappointment and shame. 4 rings, 5 rings. Grayson swallowed hard, his throat dry. The phone felt heavy in his hand, like it carried the weight of all his mistakes. Finally, he pressed the answer button. "Hello?" His voice came out rough, uncertain, nothing like the commanding tone he'd once used in his courtroom. The silence on the other end stretched out, becoming almost unbearable. He could hear soft breathing, could almost picture Rebecca gathering her courage. Then her voice, clear but cautious. "Dad, meet me for coffee. Just once." The words hit him like a physical force. His fingers tightened around the phone until his knuckles turned white. He wanted to say something profound, something that would convey everything he'd realized over the past year. He wanted to tell her about his regrets, about the shame that kept him awake at night, about how seeing that young black man in court had finally opened his eyes. But all he could manage was a single word: "Okay." The simple response hung in the air between them. It wasn't eloquent, it wasn't profound, but it was honest, and maybe that's what Rebecca needed to hear. For the first time since his world had crumbled, since he'd lost everything he'd spent decades building, Grayson allowed himself to feel something dangerous: hope. The small coffee shop buzzed with morning chatter, but Rebecca sat alone at a corner table, her fingers wrapped tightly around her cup. Her professional attire, a crisp blazer and pencil skirt, stood in stark contrast to the casual atmosphere. Her eyes darted to the door every few seconds. When Grayson walked in, she almost didn't recognize him. His expensive suits were gone, replaced by worn khakis and a faded sweater. His shoulders, once squared with authority, now curved inward. His hair had more gray than she remembered. He approached slowly, like a man walking through deep water. "Rebecca," he said softly, pulling out the chair across from her. She didn't smile. "Dad." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the whir of the espresso machine and distant conversations. Rebecca stirred her coffee, though it needed no stirring. "I don't want excuses, Dad," she said finally, her voice firm but not harsh. "I want to know if you even understand what you did." Grayson's hands rested on the table, fingers interlaced. He looked down at them, hands that had once wielded so much power, now trembling slightly. "I do," he said quietly, "and I know sorry isn't enough." Rebecca watched him carefully, searching his face for any trace of the defensive pride she'd known all her life. But she saw something different, something that looked almost like shame. "That boy," she said, "Elijah, he could have been any of my clients, any of the people you sentenced." Her voice caught slightly. "He could have been my child someday." Grayson's face tightened with pain. For the first time in his life, he didn't try to justify or explain. He just listened. "I spent my whole career fighting against men like you," Rebecca continued. "Men who saw guilt in skin color, who saw threats instead of children." She paused, taking a steadying breath. "My own father." The coffee between them grew cold, untouched. Outside, people hurried past the window, unaware of the weight of truth being spoken inside. "I can't change what I did," Grayson said finally. "But I see it now. All of it. Every ruling, every assumption, every life I affected." He met her eyes. "Every time I disappointed you." Rebecca's fingers tightened around her cup. The conversation was brief, uncomfortable, heavy with years of unspoken words. But when she stood to leave, there was no anger in her movements, just quiet acknowledgement. That was something. Grayson sat at his small kitchen table, a blank notepad staring back at him. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of an old radiator. Sunlight filtered through dusty blinds, casting shadows across the empty pages. His meeting with Rebecca had stirred something inside him. Not hope exactly, but a restless need to do more than just exist. Words, apologies, promises, they felt hollow now. He needed to prove himself through actions. After making some calls to old colleagues who still answered their phones, he found work at a small legal consulting firm. The office was cramped, the pay modest, and his desk squeezed into a corner. No mahogany furniture, no power suits, no authority. Just case files and research work. "Morning, Martin," his supervisor would say. Not Judge or Your Honor. Just Martin. It stung at first, but gradually, the simplicity of it felt right. He wasn't above anyone anymore. He was starting over. The work itself was basic, reviewing contracts, checking citations, doing the grunt work he hadn't done in decades. His hands, once used to wielding a gavel, now cramped from typing reports. But each completed task felt like a tiny step forward. One Tuesday afternoon, he checked his mailbox. Among the bills and junk mail was a cream-colored envelope. His heart quickened when he recognized Rebecca's handwriting. Inside was a single note card. The message was brief, but made his hands shake. "One coffee doesn't fix everything, but maybe we can do it again sometime." Grayson stood in his hallway, reading the words over and over. His throat tightened as he carefully folded the note and slipped it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. Not redemption, not yet, but a step. Grayson sat at his small kitchen table, a blank notepad staring back at him. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of an old radiator. Sunlight filtered through dusty blinds, casting shadows across the empty pages. His meeting with Rebecca had stirred something inside him. Not hope exactly, but a restless need to do more than just exist. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up his pen, then set it down again. The weight of his past pressed heavily on his shoulders. After days of searching through job listings, he found work at a small legal consulting firm. The office was cramped, the pay modest. His new desk was a far cry from his old chambers. But there was something freeing about the simplicity of it all. His co-workers didn't bow or scrape. They barely noticed him. He was just another face in the crowd, and for the first time in decades, that felt right. Each morning, he reviewed case files, offering insights without the power to judge. It was humbling work, but honest. One particularly long afternoon, he checked his mailbox. Among the bills and junk mail sat a cream-colored envelope. His heart skipped when he recognized Rebecca's handwriting. The letter was brief, just 2 sentences, but they made his hand shake. "One coffee doesn't fix everything, but maybe we can do it again sometime." He read the words over and over, standing in the dim hallway. His throat tightened as he carefully folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. It wasn't redemption. He knew that, but it was a step. The small Italian restaurant buzzed with quiet conversation and the gentle clink of silverware. Grayson smoothed his tie, no longer expensive silk, but serviceable polyester, and walked through the door. His eyes found Rebecca immediately, sitting at a corner table near the window. She looked up and gave him a small nod. Not quite a smile, but not the cold stare he'd grown used to. This felt different from their coffee shop meetings, more significant, more real. The waiter led him to the table. Grayson's hands shook slightly as he unfolded his napkin. "Thank you for suggesting dinner," he said softly. Rebecca ordered pasta. Grayson chose chicken. They ate in silence for several minutes, but it wasn't the tense silence of their early meetings. This silence felt peaceful, almost comfortable. "I'm not saying I forgive you, Dad," Rebecca said suddenly, setting down her fork. Grayson looked up from his plate. "I wouldn't believe you if you did," he admitted. Something shifted then. Rebecca asked about his consulting work. He told her about a challenging case. She mentioned a new coffee shop near her office. He talked about the book he was reading. Simple things, normal things. The kind of conversation a father and daughter should have. The waiter cleared their plates. Rebecca stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "The firm's expanding," she said. "I might make a partner next year." Pride swelled in Grayson's chest. Not the old pride of power and position, but something warmer, something real. He lifted his water glass, looking at his daughter across the table. "To second chances." Rebecca hesitated, her glass halfway up. Then, with the ghost of a smile, she clinked it against his. If you enjoyed the story of Martin, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.